at an increasing pace for the rest of the lifespan of everyone alive today in the state and around the planet. What we can do is take a two-pronged approach, multi-pronged approach. On the one hand, we need to do everything we can to slow down the pace of climate change by getting our emissions to zero and then actually getting to negative emissions. We have to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere. But then we also need to start managing our landscape in ways, more intensively in ways that will reduce our vulnerability and reduce the impact of the fires that we do have. And similarly, we need to start thinking more carefully about our communities, their spatial footprint, how we develop in the future, where we put new housing. We have a severe housing crisis in the state already. If we use it as an opportunity to infill in existing communities where we can create more housing options that are safer and don't increase the risk and the difficulty of managing these fires in the wildland-urban interface, we'd be much better off than if we allow more sprawling development that puts more and more people at risk and makes it more and more difficult to manage these fire seasons going into the future. And I'll stop here and entertain questions. The two biggest dams, 2 years of the flow of the river, and all of them together about 4 years of the average flow of the river. In California, it's a different situation. We have a bunch of smaller dams on smaller rivers and tributaries, and a lot of our storage is really in the snow. So we manage those dams in California for flood control earlier in the season, and then as we get later into the spring, we manage them for water supply. And because we're getting more rain and less snow, and then warmer temperatures in the spring mean that the snow we do have melts out sooner, we're getting that snow melt runoff pulse earlier and earlier in the year. And now we have a conflict between how we want to manage those dams. We want to manage them for flood control at the same time that we're also trying to manage them for water supply. So we don't have the redundancy in storage in California that allows us to make up for this shift in the timing of the spring snowmelt. And we're losing that sort of natural storage of the snowpack in the mountains. And that is also extending our fire season, because now our mountain forests will dry out sooner in the year. And that can move the fire season back much earlier at those elevations. And we have a water storage problem as well. So all of this goes together. If you look at that really extreme drought we had in the previous decade, that was the strongest, most intense drought in California in at least 1,200 years. And it was greatly exacerbated by climate change, both through its effects on temperature and on snow, amount of snow and timing of snow melt, and then the variability of precipitation. All those things were basically enhanced impacts on this drought because of climate change. And that just underscores the insecurity of our water supply going forward. But it also has had a tremendous impact on the wildfires that we've been experiencing in the state since that time, because a lot of vegetation was killed. And so we have this standing dead vegetation, as well as the new stuff that's growing up and drying out in our dry season. And so some of the fires that we're experiencing this year, for example, are greatly enhanced. So they're much more severe because of these accumulated dead fuels from the drought and the related beetle infestations that occurred in our forests.
Dr. Westerling, can you stay on for two more questions? One from Frank Blanquette and one from Pilar Marrero.
Yes.
Okay, Frank, could you please ask your question?
Yes. Dr. Westerling, can you comment on the traditional fire burning practiced by California tribes, among other tribes, and how that might help control these fires in the future? These cultural burns basically aim to clean up the overgrown brush that would be fuel for these really big fires, and traditionally hundreds of thousands of acres were burned this way. Can you comment on that, and is that something that's being thought about as a use to combat this in the future?
So yes, it was a primary way that the indigenous peoples in California managed the landscape for increased productivity and reducing fire risk. And it's not something that just doesn't happen today. There are a whole cadre of, especially federal land managers, that employ very aggressive fuels management practices that are basically modeled after this, but informed by science about current conditions as well. And they include quite a few personnel from the tribes in California working through the Bureau of Indian Affairs fire apparatus. I think that it's a useful perspective, and but I don't think that there's like a huge army of traditional fire management practitioners that aren't already engaged in fire management. So I don't think that it's like a human resource that we can greatly expand to come to our rescue now. We can certainly learn from practices, especially if there's something that was done in the past that has not been incorporated now. We should definitely take a look at it. The difficulty going forward is that it's the same difficulty we have when we're modeling fire and what can happen under climate change is we're moving into climate states, so climatic conditions that are outside the range, not just of recent historical experience, but outside the range of the Holocene since the last ice age. And so whether it's traditional practices of the communities that evolved their land management practices in response to the environment that they found themselves in, or the management policies of federal and state agencies, over a much briefer period today. In either case, they cannot no longer just be looking at the past experience that informed how they do things today. They have to be projecting into a very complex and different future and trying to adapt the lessons of the past in a way that they're still applicable to dealing with the risks that are changing as we move into the future. And that is a really difficult challenge for all of us, regardless of where we come from, because the future, on the one hand, is more certain than ever before in human history, because before we could say, well, you can look at past variability and it might increase by this much or decrease by that much. But looking forward, we know it's always going to be warmer than before. And
Dr. Westerling, could I
yes.
ask you to address Pilar's question before we run out of time?
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No, please go ahead.
Please.
Thank you, Dr. Westerling. Thank you, Sunita. Doctor, I just wanted to know what's your take on the agendas of the presidential candidates. We know that President Trump has pulled back of the Paris Agreement. He has loosened regulations on toxic air pollution. I mean, he has done a number of things that seem to be taking us backwards in this area. Have you seen anything on Joe Biden's agenda? And what do you think that could overcome this? And what do you think will happen with the second Trump administration?
So I think the basic issue is not any specific policy. It's that one party and one administration is completely divorced from science. They're not interested in hearing about the scientific conclusions about fire, about climate change, about land management. And the other is still traditionally a typical sort of party of good governance that is willing to listen to the science. And science, as well as our past experiences as individuals and as communities, is a primary way of understanding reality in the world, right? So if you're not engaged with the science, you're not engaged with reality. And especially in a situation where reality is changing in unprecedented ways since, our civilization arose, you cannot be successful in the long term without being engaged with the science.
Thank you. That was an alarming video, Dr. Shende. Please continue with your comments.
Right. Thank you very much. So having shown that video, let me start straight away with the January 2020, which was declared by NOAA in USA the hottest January anytime in the last 140 years. January 2020 was also the most abrupt January in the history of humanity, because from that month, we started a catastrophic journey on this planet into unknown with, I must say, shamefully unprepared health systems and dreadfully individualistic knowledge management. Now, let me explain to you what those bombastic words mean. I mean shameful because the countries that boasted or still boast of nuclear weapons and star wars in order to defend their countries and borders and the people are miserably and desolately brought to knees and led to the cliff to hang on. And this tiny coronavirus, from which they cannot protect their own population, leave alone the border and the countries. And these countries are fighting a war that cannot kill the invisible enemy of few hundred microns. This tiny micron size enemy, having played a guerrilla warfare with us, now is showing further potential to mutate with cruel speed that points to the fatal future that looks dark, almost like a sixth extinction. Indeed, we have been talking about it, about the sixth extinction, for now few decades. But now it does not look far and further. The world is in reality at the introspection of two disasters, health and climate change. That is the subject. And thank you to the team, Ethnic Media Services, Alexandra, Sunita, Jessica, and Sandra, for organizing this event at this strategic but painful moment. I hope this moment would trigger some introspection and, more importantly, for